Good afternoon, everyone. Would like to first thank Stefan for asking me to introduce the session and the project of today. He did so as head of Department of Theatre Studies. And it actually makes sense because I'm very pleased that this is happening, and I'm going to quickly, very briefly tell you why. A lot of activity goes on within the department, more than the immediately visible, therefore more than the teaching and the undergraduate activities that we have. A lot of research goes on, a lot of activity goes on in relation to research practices that are conducted within the department that may not be immediately visible. These are taking place at postgraduate level with students that are reading for their masters or PhDs, potential students that we are constantly in contact with, but also and more importantly by the members of staff. And this is extremely important. A university is a university only because there is research going on. If there is no research going on, it is just like any other school, primary or secondary school or tertiary school that you find elsewhere. University in itself is a place where knowledge is not only acknowledged, but is created and generated. And this can only be done through research. So therefore, what Stefan is proposing today is actually giving a package to the research that he has been conducting and that has been going on within the context of a project that he created. So just to not waste much more time from Stefan, I'm going to introduce Stefan. Also, I know you know who Stefan is, but it's also important now to see Stefan within the context of the research that he conducts. Stefan is, apart from being a lecturer within the context of the department, is also director of research and internationalization of the School of Performing Arts. His main area of research is the transmission of embodied training with an emphasis on modern practices, especially, as you obviously all know, Stanislavski's system. He has written a number of essays that appeared in various journals, including the Studies in Theatre and Performance, Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, Theatre, Dance and Performance Training, Theatre Studies International, and Theatre History Studies. Stefan has also edited 2 books. The first is Stanislavski in the World, The System and Its Transformations Across Continents. This book is co-edited with Professor Jonathan Pitches from the University of Leeds. It's published by Bloomsbury. It appeared in 2017. And the other is a book published by the University of Malta Press, which came out this year, 2018, entitled Interdisciplinarity in the Performing Arts Contemporary Perspectives, co-edited with Dr. Malaika Sarkotomas from the Department of Dance. Also, you should know that Stefan is at the moment working on a monograph which is going to deal with modern theatre in Russia, expected in 2020, and it will be published by Bloomsbury. Stefan, please tell us more about this project entitled Cultural Transmission of Actor Training Techniques.
Thank you, Mario. And I would like first and foremost to welcome you all to the launch of Cultural Transmission of Actor Training Techniques, a research project based at the Department of Theatre Studies, and of which I am the director and coordinator. As I will explain in this presentation, the project aims to analyze how actor training techniques are transmitted across cultures. The project also has a clear outreach dimension and serves as a networking platform to bring together practitioners, students, teachers, and researchers interested in theatre pedagogy, in theatre education. In this presentation, I will introduce cultural transmission as a theoretical framework underpinning the project, after which I will expound on the first education event organized within the project's remit, namely a series of workshops with visiting practitioners who tackle Stanislavski's Magic Cave with theatre studies students. Now, defining what cultural transmission is. So, broadly speaking, cultural transmission is an emerging critical framework that studies the transfer process carrying cultural information from one generation to the next, and from one group of people to the other. This definition is a useful starting point, I feel, because it foregrounds two important elements, namely process and content, the latter referred to here as cultural information. Both process and content are, in the eyes of cultural transmission theories, highly diversified phenomena. Transmission processes invoke the channels through which knowledge moves from one context to the other. This seminar presentation is, for instance, an example of such a channel in which knowledge is being exchanged from a clearly identifiable source, the transmitter, myself, to a group of recipients, yourself in the audience. That's the transmission that is taking place here. These transmission channels can take many forms, including imprinting, conditioning, observation, imitation. These are often associated with the domain of everyday life. But there are also instances of direct teaching, located in more explicit transmission contexts like technical schools or training contexts. The content that goes through cultural transmission is equally broad in nature and may include combinations of social orientations or attitudes, values, skills, and knowledge, but also behaviors. I will be expounding a little bit on these later on. Cultural transmission is, therefore, first and foremost interested in a series of hows. How is knowledge exchanged and shared? How does knowledge move and migrate from one context to the other? How is knowledge both appropriated, owned anew, and transformed, changed, and hybridized when it goes through cultural transmission? Following discourses which Anthony Grafton develops, cultural transmission concentrates first on the processes of transmission. Its studies, therefore, do not offer new definitions of culture and operate on the basis of highly diverse implied definitions of it. Culture is certainly seen as a multifarious phenomenon, often described as a broad rather than restrictive array of activities. Instead of developing further a definition of culture within this context, I would like to emphasize that what is central to cultural transmission is the fluidity and transformative potential of culture, a point articulated by David Oswell as follows. So to study a culture means not to analyze the habits, customs, beliefs, ideas, and arts in an enclosed and isolated place, like in a laboratory, but to investigate the connections and disconnections, the circulations and movements, the ups and downs that make a culture a living culture, above and beyond its singular location. That culture is fluid and adaptive chimes strongly with an understanding of actor training techniques as being equally unfixed, especially when they undergo processes of transmission, and giving rise to sometimes unexpected interpretations, adaptations, and applications. A technique changes when it is transmitted. It is this shared fluid dynamic which I feel particularly facilitates a use of cultural transmission in the study of actor training. Now, even though the use of cultural transmission as a critical framework is still in its infancy, so it's still a new thing as a critical framework, cultural transmission has already developed a fruitful dialogue with other disciplines. Its theoretical conceptualizations are borrowed from various fields of study, making it multidisciplinary, even if not interdisciplinary in form. Cultural transmission also feeds back into these disciplines, in the sense that a number of fields are using it in an analytical framework to pursue their own research work. Thus, for example, in the study of human evolution, cultural transmission has substantiated, supported the understanding that sophisticated technologies, highly developed sciences, and elaborate social or religious rituals are not fundamental breaks with the past, but products of a cumulative process whereby each generation builds on the achievement of their predecessors. In family studies, then, an application of cultural transmission has been used to study possible gradations in value congruence between parents and their children. How much are values shared? In history, and I feel this is particularly intriguing, the study of transmission has led us to see that the canon of text, now considered central to the intellectual history of the West, does not include some of the most original and influential texts ever written. Works of fundamental originality and impact have been defined as peripheral by critics and historians. Cultural transmission diverts our attention from familiar and evidently rewarding enterprises to less familiar and evidently difficult ones, helping us, therefore, to uncover material which we might have considered as unimportant or marginal, which we might have sidelined in our studies. Notwithstanding these examples, the application of cultural transmission to theatre and performance is, surprisingly, an underused critical frame. So, to my knowledge, it has only seen one concrete application: to frame the transmission of Stanislavski's system across continents within a published study which I co-edited last year with Professor Jonathan Pitches of the University of Leeds. In Stanislavski in the Word, Pitches outlines an initial attempt to use cultural transmission as a way of talking about theatre and actor training. Following a definition of the term along similar lines suggested above, Pitches then considers whether cultural transmission offers a profitable structure for understanding acting transmission. Does it help us if we use it? He argues that cultural transmission is indeed profitable in the study of theatre because it brings to the surface important and often dismissed elements of performer training analysis. In a similar way to how the application of cultural transmission in history, you will start making the link, has allowed material that was previously sidelined to come to the fore. To Pitches, the application of cultural transmission to actor training in general, and Stanislavski in particular, points out three things. Actor training transmission is often a negotiation between previous teachings, what I already know, and the exposure to new ideas and techniques. Interestingly and surprisingly, again, more than technique, it's values and attitudes that are particularly present in the cross-cultural transmission of Stanislavski's ideas. And finally, in the same way that a culture is fluid and adaptable, the transmission of the system in the world did not show duplication, replication, but an endless responsiveness to local circumstances. Now, I would like to build on Pitches' analysis by suggesting a further point that is brought to the surface through an application of cultural transmission theories. Schonpflug's definition of the field, which I quoted before, also foregrounds human agency as an important aspect of cultural transmission. In other words, cultural transmission is a human activity, and while animals and humans do share genetic transmission, human beings learn from one another in ways that animals do not. Cultural transmission brings people together by attributing them the roles that we mentioned before of transmitter and recipient, even if experience shows that these categories are often too neat and limiting classifications. Theatre practitioners or teachers, for example, often remark that moments of transmission allow them to rethink or reevaluate their practice. I learned as much as I managed to teach. For example, I learned a lot in my teaching. In negotiating relationships between people, cultural transmission therefore becomes an activity with strong political implication. It has a strong political dimension. And the term politics here does not imply governance or governmental institutions, but following Andrew Haywood, its use leans towards daily realities that involve forms of influence, control, the exercise of power, and hierarchy building. Now, Cultural transmission becomes a political activity, this I would say is the key point, when, as it invariably always does, it creates groupings or clusters of people who come together because their reactions to a particular phenomenon is in some way comparable. So, for example, in our case here, we are coming together in this hour because to different degrees we are all interested in actor training. Transmission clusters are formed around notions of selectivity. I choose to be there instead of somewhere else, on choosing a transmission context over another. Cluster formation is also informed by motivation, a concept within the field of knowledge management developed by E. Bolissani, who argues that motivation can be related to various but intertwined concepts, such as personal utility, knowledge is exchanged to solve a problem or accomplish a task, the economic value, knowledge is considered as a good source of income, or social motivation, where knowledge is sharing because people belong to a particular culture, a particular context, or are co-located, to mention but a few. So the idea is here, why do people come together to share in moments of knowledge transfer, of cultural transmission? Now, Schonpflug brings together these motivating concepts under the term transmission payoff to ask why an individual partakes in transmission activity. In Bolissani's and Schonpflug's definition and theories, cultural transmission is never a neutral activity, as there are social, economic, and utilitarian reasons factored in. Modern theatre and performance, that is performing arts realities developing at the end of the 19th century and into the first decade of the 20th century, strongly reflects these considerations. In a first instant, modernism is, at least at face value, organized around shared manifestos, styles, or methodologies, evidenced by the nomenclatures of naturalism, symbolism, surrealism, futurism, conventionalism, constructivism, but also system, biomechanics, synthetic theatre, theatre of cruelty, and perhaps more broadly, the avant-garde. Second, contemporary appropriation of modern training regimes, the appropriation today of these modern practices, shows an acute reactivity to economic value and pragmatic application, especially when commodifying a source technique to render it, as Frank Camilleri writes, increasingly implicated in the processes and procedures of institutionalization. In concluding the first part of my presentation, I would like to suggest further avenues of investigation which might benefit from an application of cultural transmission as a theoretical frame, apart from this idea of the political dimension of transmission. Even if it is still at an early stage, almost all the literature that I found has appeared in the last decade, for example, Schonpflug still suggests an analytical model to apply to transmission processes, how to analyze transmission. He suggests a model to do so. Now, while I tend to question the use of rigid models, especially when they are applied to a phenomenon that is as dynamic as embodied body-based actor training, Schonpflug's model does give rise to a number of useful questions, namely, what causes the differential transmission of cultural elements or traits? What factors are responsible for the relatively high transmissibility of some elements and the relatively low transmissibility of others? Which cultural contents have a higher probability of being transmitted? Terminology has developed a lot within such analytical models, which again actor training theory might adopt. Apart from transmission payoff, these are just some other terminology terms which might be helpful in this study, in their application to the study of actor training, like transmission belts, failure of transmission, transmission gap, implicit explicit transmission, transmission awareness, and transmission rate. Finally, cultural transmission can also be used to frame the idea, which is particularly what is interesting me at the moment, that it is through transmission processes that theatre traditions are formed and consolidated. If transmission only seeks duplication and replication, then its key objective to also create new knowledge is nullified. The cultural transmission of vector training techniques does not imply homogeneity, but a tension between recurrence and difference. In this way, a technique or practice facilitates its own survival through adaptability, with the system first developed in Russia in the early decades of the 20th century, but internationally applied in contemporary theater training since then, being a case in point. Now, what I have done in this first part of this presentation is I have made some references to examples from modernism and Stanislavski, because as I already stated, the aim of the CTATT research project is to study both historical as well as contemporary and practical instances of cultural transmission of practice. I now turn my attention to an example of the latter in order to discuss the first set of events organized within the project. Last month, the project hosted a series of workshops on Stanislavski's Magic If. These workshops were delivered by Alessio Bergamo of the Accademia delle Belle Arti di Frosinone in Italy, who also has important ties with Teatro di Roma and Teatro di Toscana, Julian Jones from Rose Bruford College in CTATT, UK, and Jakub Korczak of the Academy of Performing Arts, DAMU, in Prague. Jones's visit was made possible by Erasmus Plus funds for staff mobility for teaching, while Bergamo's and Korczak's visits were supported by Arts Council Malta and the Malta Arts Fund. The department has also supported these workshops by providing the relevant spaces. What follows in the remaining part of my presentation is an analysis of the training delivered during these three workshops. The workshops directly fed into the teaching of a third-year Theatre Studies unit, THS 3111, Tradition and Transmission in Performance. And I'm very happy, of course, to see the students here in the audience. These workshops were also underpinned by a very clear research question. What are, again, the recurrences and differences in the cross-cultural transmission of the specific actor training component? Now, to start, the three practitioners gave very similar definitions to the Magic If, in a way underlining its centrality in contemporary actor training. Jones's definition is particularly direct and unembellished, very straight to the point. What would I do if I was in this specific set of circumstances? In the Stanislavski acting tradition, there is a discussion about the use of the what would I do formulation, and this relation to how would I feel, for example, a point which Bergamo picked upon during an interview he gave and which can be found online. Jones, however, avoids these debates by arguing that in his teaching, to do is an all-encompassing term that taps into the three main faculties, emotional, rational, and physical, of the actor's work. For Korczak, on the other hand, the Magic If is a lever which transfers the actor to the plane of creative fantasy. It is also expressed using the formulation, what would I do if I find myself in the given circumstances of the character? To which, however, he has the 5 W questions: when, where, who, why, and where. These nuances are a product of the practitioner's respective formation, with Korczak having undergone direct training with Maria Knebel and Bergamo with Anatoly Vasilyev. Jones, on the other hand, is a RADA graduate whose work as a teacher is informed by the American understanding of Stanislavski, by Jutta Hagen mainly, and Sanford Meisner. Now, the three practitioners, and this is where it starts getting interesting, thus give similar definitions to the Magic If, but then, however, opted to suggest very different uses for the term, for the practice. In his workshop, Bergamo used the Magic If as, very clearly for me, work on the self. That is, as preparatory work that precedes the compositional or staging considerations involved in the production of a performance. So, as he remarked, the aim of the Magic If is not to work on a desert scene, but to prepare for the work on the desert scene. Jones, on the other hand, again very clearly, was directly interested in application, in applying the Magic If to plays from the repertoire of the theatre of the absurd. His work with students therefore revolved around scene and character work, arising from UNESCO's The Lesson and Howard Barker's The Possibilities. Korczak's use was again different, and his approach during the workshop foregrounded exploration on the magic if, on using the magic if, to explore physically a set of given circumstances. Try out variations, for example. To prepare the students for this physical exploration, Korczak included in the warm-up stage exercises in the relaxation of muscles and trust building, which, with concentration, he considered the building blocks of the magic if. The three practitioners, or again here the differences start emerging, also use very different approaches to unlock the magic if. For Bergamo, unlocking the magic if revolved around play, a concept which he emphasized many and many times. Typical exercises which Bergamo included were: invent your own name, invent a new name for yourself, but think of the personality that is associated with it. The example he gave was Gertrude carries very different implications to Lily, for example. Students then introduce themselves to each other with the new name during a typical, we all did it, walking and filling up the space exercise. In doing so, however, the students were instructed to concentrate not on the personality, which I try to transmit, and which is associated with the name, but on establishing contact. The key instruction here was don't overthink, but play. A second exercise which touched on this idea of play was a student goes on the stage and takes a position on a chair. Another student follows, starts from the previous position, and then continues the action and takes it somewhere else. To this simple exercise, however, Bergamo would again always say, continue the play, rather than continue the action, continue the play. The exercises that Bergamo presented create a playful atmosphere to sensitize students to their environment. A key consideration was for the students to become open and receptive to the vibrations occurring in the space. Now, vibrations is a term, a word which Bergamo uses, vibrazioni, to mean the dynamics of sounds, rhythms, balance or imbalance on the space, movements coming from the other participants, as well as minute changes in the energies being generated in the space, in the here and now, and to which the students react in a natural and organic manner without overacting. It is the sensitivity to vibrations occurring in the space that Bergamo sees as the main objective behind using the magic if as preparation. Now, the technique which Julian Jones used to unlock the magic if was that of personalization and substitution. In line with his attempt to apply the magic if to absurd texts, Jones immediately opened the workshop by sharing with the students scenes from the plays. This was the first thing that he did, to which he also added short descriptions of the given circumstances. He also asked students to reflect on a number of magic if scenarios, emerging from the text but transposed to the student's own everyday life. So, for example, to the student playing the professor in the lesson, he asked, what do you personally, as Stefan, for example, in your own everyday life, find incredibly easy to accomplish? What do you admire most in the world? Who do you find most stupid? What makes you the happiest? What makes you most irritable? When reflecting on these questions, the students were constantly encouraged to make it personal, to choose instances from their life that are not trivial, but loaded with importance, with significance. In rehearsing and eventually performing the scenes, the students then substitute the moment in the play with these parallel, personal, and high-stake magic if scenarios. The technique of personalization and substitution, which Jones clarified has roots in American interpretation of Stanislavski, worked particularly well on the possibilities when working on Barker's play. In a moment of the play, one character laments the hard labor she was doing involving the digging of a well. Those are the given circumstances, lamenting this hard labor. The students started playing this moment when Jones signaled substitute for the student to switch the script's words with her own personal description of a task which she, in that moment, was finding particularly hard to accomplish. Being close to end of term, the students entered into a tirade about the completion of her dissertation, much to the approval of the other third-year students in the class, I may add. Jones then signaled another substitute, at which point the student returned back to the original text, but with what was clearly a much more urgent delivery. Korczak's technique to unlock the magic if, to work with students on the magic if, was what he called dramatic situation, a term developed at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague to signify Stanislavski's last phase of work. Dramatic situations are scenarios on which students improvise and create etudes. All three practitioners worked on scenarios and worked on improvisations, but Korczak did especially so. His scenarios took different forms, from fantasy-based scenarios, like you are a large bird flying across a landscape with a light body and experiencing freedom, to mild real-life scenarios, example, you are in a gallery looking at pictures, and high-stake ones. You are in a concentration camp, for example, exhausted, but you know that if you fall, you will get shot. Help someone who is about to fall. These dramatic situations are defined not by a possible attachment to realistic or naturalistic drama, it's not the point, but to the evidence, the making evident changes or turns in the development of the scenario. These changes need to be clear and concrete so as to give the scene a basic sense of composition. Korczak also used scenario work to sensitize students to the importance of process and as a means of opening something in the participants, in their training and in their character work. In line with his emphasis on exploration, on trying out different things, Korczak's constant question was, what is this process allowing you to discover about yourself and about your here and now? This consideration underlined all the exercises and improvisations done. For example, during the warm-up phase, Korczak used an exercise to unlock the spine. Imagine it was a serpent. But he fixed the student's attention not on the end result, but on going through the process of each and every backbone. Other exercises were treated to the same objective of exploration. They included, for example, the performance of very small movements, even closing and opening the thumbs to form a fist or an open hand, or the creation of circles with your hands, expanding their size to the arms, the torso, the legs, and eventually the whole body. Another exercise, again working on this exploration, was the walk in the space with a center of energy, located in your head, like a wise man, in your belly, like a gluttonous person, or in your eye, like a spy. Scenario work was also informed by a constant attention to process, which was facilitated through the way that he delivered instructions, always adding one layer at a time. Now, process was also an important consideration for Jones and Bergamo. So we start seeing this idea of recurrence and difference emerging and where it emerges. It appeared this importance given to process as an objective in the many scenarios attempted. Before discussing Bergamo, it is interesting to note that both Jones and Korczak used the in the fog scenario, showing that such an exercise is entering actor training lore. What would I do if it gets foggy and the stakes are getting higher? I am walking by the mountainside. I am not sure where the edges are. I know there are wolves around and the storm is coming. Okay? Both practitioners suggested this scenario as a way of connecting the participants to their inner life or inner work. Consequently, students performed the scenario together in the same space, but individually. Bergamo, on the other hand, was more looking at sensitizing the students to what was happening on the outside, in the space of work, in line with his work on vibrations. His scenario still exhibited, of course, a process-like and developmental arch. The scenario that he suggested, however, and contrary to Jones and Korczak, were often performed in partners. And one such example is the journey scenario. In this exercise, Bergamo gave a rhythm to dictate a particular walk, and the students were asked to think of a personal and significant context. Example, going to visit a lover. Each student then took a partner for a walk through the scenario, but silently, using subtle changes in the energy to hint at different moments in the journey. Conclusion. While the practitioners gave very similar definitions of the magic if, the three applied this actor training element to very different uses. They also showed different approaches to unlock the practice, reflective of their formation context. I would like also to add that the three practitioners had sort of the same rules to the game. So they worked with a very similar pool of students, and they worked for a duration of 4 hours, 2 hours and 2 hours. So the rules of the game were very similar and shared within the three workshops. Now, the results emerging from these workshops can be summarized graphically as follows. Bergamo's training with Vasiliev led him to emphasize play as a means to unlock the magic if, and to use this to expose students to preparatory phases in actor technique. His approach was exercise-based. Jones was more interested in the application of the magic if to playtext, which he facilitated by using the personalization and substitution technique he first encountered at RADA. His approach, therefore, was text-oriented. Korczak, on his part, foregrounded an ethics of exploration within a consistent use of dramatic situation and the work on etudes, which chimes strongly with Stanislavski's final phase of work as it was then developed by Maria Knebel. His approach to the magic if was improvisation-focused. Finally, I am only left with a brief reference to the project's website and the mention of what the future has in store for the project. So the website has two objectives. First of all, of course, I am using the website to keep people informed of events the project organizes in the latest news section. Second, my intention is also to use the website as a knowledge repository, however, related to actor training. At the moment, this takes two forms: the pictures collected from the workshops and an interview section. The website currently contains two such interviews with Bergamo and Jones. The website address is www.ctatt.org. For the future, the project can be expected to host one visiting practitioner a year to work on the transmission of actor training techniques. It is also invested in convening, with the Department of Theatre Studies here and Rose Bruford College, UK, a major international symposium on Stanislavski. This symposium, this conference, will be held in Malta in April 2019. Finally, the project is supporting my own writing of a monograph titled Modern Theatre in Russia, Tradition Building and Transmission Processes, which, as Mario has said in the beginning, has been recently contracted and has an expected publication date of 2020. This monograph will be the first work to read modern theatre in Russia through the cultural transmission lens, developing some of the ideas first explored in Stanislavski in the World. As you can see, the project will be very active, and I invite you all to like its Facebook page to remain in touch with future developments. Thank you.